So today we'd like to welcome two very special people, Eddie Harrell and Kevin Griffin. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Eddie serves as Regional Vice President for Radio 1. Prior to coming to Cleveland, he served at Radio 1 in Columbus. And prior to that, he also served for 5 years as President and CEO of the Urban League in Columbus. He's a board member of his alma mater, Otterbein College, and a former board member of COSI in Columbus and KIP, Knowledge is Power. Most importantly, he is a longtime season ticket holder for the Cleveland Browns and made that trek up north on 71 on many occasions. And we're also pleased, and I know he's proud, that he is an alum of Leadership Cleveland 2015. And you do have a fan club here today, Eddie. And also Kevin Griffin. Kevin currently serves as a Senior Vice President of Marketing and Strategy at Adcom, a position he has held for 4 years. Prior to that, you're going to sense a theme here. He served as Vice President of the Fan Experience and Marketing for, yes, the Cleveland Browns. Prior to that, he was with the Seattle Seahawks. He is a youth football and track coach in Strongsville, and sports are at the center of his life still, as I think he's currently waiting for his daughter to finish gymnastics practice. He is a board chair for the Cleveland Peacemakers Alliance of the Boys and Girls Clubs and a member of Leadership Cleveland 2019. So Kevin reached out to me several weeks ago and shared an idea that he was working on with Eddie and with their fellow LC alum, Keith Hotchkiss, of iHeartRadio. And I think what they were trying to do echoes a personal philosophy that Kevin once shared, and it is to live humbly, attack each day with an infectious passion that uplifts others. Strive to fulfill my divine purpose, love, learn, and lead. And lead is exactly what they did in forming an amazing collaboration to deliver Justice for All, a conversation about race, equality, and inclusion on June 17th. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ian and Kevin and acknowledge that Keith is on a well-deserved vacation right now. Gentlemen?
Thank you, Marianne and Rachel and everyone who's put this together. We really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with fellow leaders from here around the Northeast Ohio and Cleveland community. Eddie and I briefly spoke and discussed how we kind of wanted to kick this thing off today. And what we wanted to do is kind of set this up with a brief background of how we arrived at the idea for a 90-minute kind of conversation over 21 different radio stations across Cleveland at one point in time. So I'm going to start there and then turn it over to Eddie and give you a bit of background, and we'll go back and forth with each other if you don't mind. So the following weekend, so first of all, Eddie and I happen to know each other we're in somewhat of the same industry. Eddie leads a number of incredible radio stations and digital properties here, not only in Northeast Ohio, but across the state of Ohio with Radio 1. I'm obviously in marketing and advertising, and so we've gotten to know each other during my time at the Cleveland Browns and at my time as well at Adcom. We've built a rapport and friendship. And following the weekend of protest around the country after George Floyd was brutally murdered in front of us all, I just sent Eddie a note and said, so what's next? I believe that, or what now? Something of that nature in terms of an email. And was just reaching out to Eddie to see what we might be able to do. I'd spent the weekend and then particularly Monday just listening to some of the content on his stations across the Radio 1 platform, as well as other radio stations across the dial here in Northeast Ohio. And quite frankly, I was hearing two different conversations, and there were two different conversations. I felt like people's values were somewhat similar, but they just weren't like kind of singing off the same hymnal. And so I asked Eddie, what might we be able to do? And fortunately, he emailed me back and said, hey, let's have a conversation. And we did. And we really had no idea at that point in time what might happen. What we just wanted to do is have a conversation about where we were. And in the business of communication and marketing, the first thing you should do is really be an incredible listener. And that's what I think Eddie and I tried to do. From there, we decided after about a half hour, 45-minute call, hey, how could we possibly leverage the strength of Eddie's radio stations and all of his communications platforms across Radio 1 And then we said, hey, what about other people? And how do we begin to have a conversation that we're hearing on some stations along with the same type of conversation that we're having at Eddie's conversation? The idea was simply this: people weren't saying the same thing, and because we weren't saying the same thing, we weren't starting at the same place, and that non-commonality was prohibiting us from kind of moving forward. So that was how we got started, and I'll hand it off to Eddie to take it from there in terms of what we did next.
Yeah, I think that, again, I want to thank everybody, Rachel and Marianne, for giving us this platform, and for all of you listening today. I think it's an important conversation, and Kevin gave a great context for how we got there. One of the things we realize is that, historically, our stations across the country are really target African Americans. So, on any Radio 1 station, you're going to hear a hip hop format on R&B or gospel or sort of news talk, primarily directed towards the African American audience. And historically, in situations like we saw the first weekend of protests, we do some things that are very flexible. We had the mayor on, we had the police chief on to talk to our audience, and our primary focus was pushing the idea of peaceful protest, because we didn't want to be engaged in inciting anybody to do things that are property destruction or personal injury. We wanted to make sure that we were informative about peaceful protesting. Also, historically, and Black radio is really viewed as a vehicle to speak to the community. So we opened up our phone lines. We cut off the music many times that weekend and really allowed people to call and talk about their frustrations, but also use it as a teachable moment as well. And so typically in those type of situations, our audience agrees with the things that we're talking about. They agree about social justice and attacking inequalities. And so when Kevin sent me the email and we had our initial discussion, what we agreed upon is that to have the discussion with my audience, which is a big audience in Northeast Ohio, is somewhat preaching to the choir, and that we need to engage those outside of that audience about what's going on and be part of the solution-based process. And so, we just cooked up in, a 30, 45-minute conversation is what would it look like if, could we imagine a day where we could get all the radio partners in Cleveland to agree to do a simulcast forum on the same topic at the same time, and see what the appetite for that was. To my surprise, and I guess I really shouldn't be surprised, because, moving up here, I saw how close-knit this community is in times of need, that all the radio partners of the major groups, inclusive of my stations at Radio 1, iHeart, Intercom, which was formerly CBS, Good Karma, which is ESPN, and Salem, all quickly said yes. So, that was the first barrier that we really had to get over, is was there a willingness to talk about the issue of race and social justice across all of our platforms at the same time. And so once the yes was put out there by everybody, then we were able to quickly move and do something that has been unprecedented in the media industry across the country, to have competing groups put down that competition for 90 minutes and run the same thing across all of our networks at the same time. Now, that was monumental, and it was an agreement made by the leaders pretty quickly, actually. And so that allowed us to then, put more of an effort into what's this going to look like and the content. So, Kevin, I'll pass back to you to talk about sort of the next steps there.
Yeah, and I want to point back to one of the things that I think is so important with Leadership Cleveland, and that is the importance of relationships. And Eddie, you touched on that, what that means and how we value that here in Northeast Ohio. But as Eddie and I wrapped up the conversation, it was our original conversation was, okay, who do we reach out to and who do we know? And fortunately, between the two of us, not only do we know everyone with one exception, we had incredible relationships with these folks. And so to ask them, would they be willing to go to their corporations and step up? And also, how do they sell that into their own staffs? Fortunately, we have trusting relationships, and that matters a lot here, as everyone on this call knows, in Northeast Ohio. And so Sam and Keith, who's one of our Leadership Cleveland classmates now, or colleagues, and Tim and everyone stepped up, and there was a level of trust that then allowed us to kind of move fast. And so you've probably heard the saying that you move at the speed of trust. And so because we had that trust as a baseline, we were able to get going. And so then those relationships extended once we solidified the concept. We were able to reach out to the mayor's office again, trusting relationship between a number of us with the mayor's office and the chief of police and Calvin Williams, and then others that we began to populate. And as Eddie mentioned, the real work was, after we got beyond the yes, was how do we begin to program the conversation? Who are the guests? What would be the most appropriate conversation to have for the community? And then how do we bring a balance? And what we meant by a balance was, number one, there are no sides. That was a really important factor as we laid out kind of the memo of understanding, like there aren't any sides here, but what we do need to do is in some way, shape, or form begin to bring everyone to the table so we can start our conversation moving forward from a place of commonality. What had been interesting, and I know, I hope you don't mind, Eddie, but I think you and I both expressed that throughout that weekend and even into Monday, we had phone calls from our Black and white friends, and they were similar conversations. Our white friends were looking for space to be able to express their opinion in a safe way, even if it was maybe off kilter, but they needed to express themselves and were looking for guidance. Our African-American friends and colleagues were saying, hey, what are we going to do next? Because I'm feeling a certain way, I'm living a certain experience, but that's not being articulated across the dial. And so that's what we were able to do, and able to bring the mayor to the table, and thanks to a number of folks in his office, and able to bring Calvin Williams, Chief Williams, and then other leaders, including David Gilbert. And I think we put together what hopefully was a good show. It was I'll transition into the event once we got there on June 17th. It was poignant, and there were a lot of moments within that show where I was uncomfortable. And I remember sending Eddie a text saying, this is like award-winning content, but I'm uncomfortable, which was good because we were beginning to have conversations across the dial. If I were only listening to that content on a Radio 1 station, I would have been comfortable. But knowing the audience, I knew that there were things that other people were going to be hearing for the first time, and or maybe not actually agree with, which was the point of the show. So that's how we got there, building the relationships to end up getting the right type of content and message. Originally we had an idea of could the show be an hour. Ultimately, it probably could have been 2 hours. And then one of the things that, as we're self-reflective, is to think, okay, what do we do next after this? We kind of threw out a grenade in terms of a conversation, but there wasn't necessarily a structured follow-up for people to either continue the dialogue or to move to action. And that's one of the areas I hope we can begin to focus on as we go into the summer months.
I think that we, again, Kevin talked about the different phone calls we received, after the first weekend, from our white, friends and colleagues, and our Black friends and colleagues and family. And again, the conversations were a lot different, even with our colleagues within the media industry. As we started to think of how do we put this together, there was concerns that this just doesn't turn into a political conversation, because it's much broader than that. So once we got the trust that this is a healthy dialogue, and it's not the forum where all the answers are going to be, we're not going to come away with all the answers, but at least starting the conversation is part of the solution-based process. And that is, for many, the uncomfortable piece. So we have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And that starts with being willing to tackle the issues head on. And so when we, thought of who can we get to moderate this, because that was a key decision-making point, that we had to pick somebody that had the trust and credibility across all spectrums, whether it was a conservative leaning format, a praise format, somebody that the community would recognize. And so we quickly realized Ramona Robinson was that person. And so we talked to her, and her first thing she said to me when I talked, she says, I'm not giving softballs. So if you want me to lob softballs at people, I'm not your person, because this is a serious topic. And if I'm going to, and this is her speaking, if I'm going to invest 90 minutes of my time on such a sensitive topic, I need to have the flexibility to really attack the issues. And so we gave her full, license to craft the questions and the conversation as she saw fit, and because she's the award-winning journalist. And so we gave her that space. And so, we did have political leadership with Mayor Jackson. We had, Police Chief Williams, but we needed somebody to be reflective of the grassroots communities out there. And that's why we chose Marsha Mockaby, who's CEO of the Urban League of Greater Cleveland. And then from a business leader's perspective, I think there was no better person than David Gilbert, who, as you all guys know, runs the Destination Cleveland and the Greater Cleveland Sports Commission, who really has a great sense of CEO and executive level leadership here in Cleveland, because we didn't want to leave that out of the conversation, because as Kevin, discussed, some of the discussions that I had, right after that first weekend was some from my C-level friends, C-suite level friends, Caucasian friends that would say, hey, I want to do the right thing. And these were legitimate conversations that I had with a person says, I want to do the right thing. I want to be helpful in this, but I don't know what to say. Or if I say something, if I say it the wrong way, then I'm going to be, I'll be running uphill at that point, because then you're backtracking and have to clean up things. And so that really helped Kevin and I determine that this really needed to be a broad-based conversation, because we felt from a corporate and civic and community leadership, there was a willingness to do and help and do the right thing, but there are many of those that need help having that initial conversation. And so we wanted to create that space to do that.
Yeah, and I'll add, if you don't mind, Eddie, that I think what was interesting is it was so vivid to watch George Floyd die in front of us, and that sparked a motivation. And I think all on this call understand the concept of motivation, which was, hey, everyone's eyes were wide open now, and so hopefully we could take advantage of this moment to have the right conversation, because their eyes are open. Hopefully their hearts are open along with their minds at the same time. But motivation is different than inspiration, and motivation gives you we thought a week or two, right? And then we didn't want to lose that motivation, and then take this moment of time to inspire more people to get involved. And that inspiration is going to have longer lingering effect than just this moment of time, because believe it or not, it's because our news cycle moves so darn fast, people probably have somewhat kind of forgotten about the way they felt at that moment when they saw George Floyd and that murder. And quite candidly, I haven't experienced anything really like this in my life, where when I see that video now, it's the other day, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, it triggers something inside of me. It physically triggers something to see his life taken away. So we wanted to use that moment in time to get people, while it was still important to them, why they still had questions, and why, quite frankly, they were somewhat emotional about what they saw. So hopefully we're able to accomplish that. I'll end with this before maybe we open up with questions, Rachel, is that I know we missed in a couple of areas, really a couple of really important areas. Number one, what was the follow-up? And number two, the young people who were out on the streets actually protesting and doing the really hard grassroots work, their voices weren't heard during our show, during the program. And that was a miss. And that wasn't a miss by design. That was just, we were moving fast. And as we know here in Cleveland, you work with people that you trust, and you work usually with institutions that are already established. And that's how we ended up with our show guests. But I think we have to continue to, number one, support, and number two, honor the young people who are out here doing the hard work. And when it's time for them to when they're tired, then someone else has to pick it up and support them in other ways. So we got to keep this going. And that's really, really important. I hope through this moment that more young people, and I don't mean super young, but younger people and people whose voices haven't been heard from a leadership perspective in our community, their voices begin to be heard, and they have a seat at the table as we go forward.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that some of the post reaction was some of the same, and it's there's a recognition that our younger voices in the community need that forum, and so I suspect if we were to do something like this again, that we would do something virtually. We would hit the young people where they're at, because they're large consumers of social media. And so there's a different way to approach them, and we'll make sure we do that, next time. Again, we were fast on this because we wanted to make sure we were operating in the moment, and to get that many broadcasters to agree to do something. You move while you have the agreement. to get it done, and we were to get it done. And some of the post reaction has been, I think, very positive. I think some things that for us to learn from as well. But some of the post reaction I've received is thanks for having the conversation, because it allows people to at least open the door to have the conversation. That's black, white, and others. Yes. Because the feedback that I'm getting is starting the conversation is perhaps the hardest part. And then once you do that, then you can create a system where people are operating a safe space to talk about biases, to talk about experiences that people have had, and for people to actually listen. And that's I think the biggest takeaway we can really take from this is the forum for people to listen and then operate in a safe space to do what they think is the right thing is probably the biggest thing that could come out of this. And so our small part of part we could play in doing this was well worth it. For 21 stations to play the same content for 90 minutes is a big deal. And I want to thank all of our partners for doing that and with such expedience, because it was something that we thought was important.
And quite frankly, as we've done the research, and nothing like that has really ever happened around the country before. There might be one other example that's somewhat close, but not to the degree where you brought 5 different competitors together to the table to work. And I'll end with this before we open up the question. But one of the things that was really important for me to not only to hear and learn about, but also to watch during my time with Leadership Cleveland was to really understand that it's not always the what for a leader, but it's also the how, and the care and the professionalism and the tact that Eddie and Keith and Tim and Tom all displayed throughout these conversations and somewhat negotiations was really, really important. And Eddie, I tip my cap to you of even conversations with Ramona and her husband as we negotiated her participation was so darn important. So I share that as an outcome of things that are important as we lead. It's also the how, and that's really important in what we do as we go forward.
And one last note before we do pass over for questions. I think it's important. I want to make sure we recognize some of the people behind the scenes or the efforts that happen. Kevin really was, served as an executive producer for this, but we also had the engineers from all 5 groups that had to work behind the scenes hand in hand so it could actually happen on air at the same time, and it was simultaneous. So big kudos to those, Gary Zoccolo, who's the chief engineer at Radio 1, and working with his engineering colleagues across the market who have a high level of collegiality amongst each other to make the technical side of that work. And that's part of sort of the byproduct of this thing, is that we proved that people from different, even from competitive landscapes, can work together when there's a common goal.
Well, thank you both for sharing kind of the behind the scenes of bringing this important conversation to the airwaves. And we have had a few questions come in. So to start, were you able to generate any metrics that indicated how many people might have tuned in to the production?
And Kevin, I'll start with, we know that we had which was higher than probably our typical, well, not high, not any lower than our typical broadcast, just based on the number of phone calls we received. And we actually did stream these on our station. So we've not put together a comprehensive report from all 5 broadcasters, but I know from, at least from our end, it was well tuned in, and so we can actually report that back out. I think that's one of the things we got it done. And Brett's probably collectively having come back together and say, well, how many people listen? We do know that, some of from our competitors, our colleagues, that, on some stations, they got some feedback that wasn't quite so positive because, it was a very dicey subject. And sometimes people just don't want to hear something that makes them uncomfortable. And so some of the phone calls or emails that some of our colleagues received weren't all rosy pictures being painted, but I see that as a positive thing, because at least we were willing, and I really commend our colleagues, because they knew that they had some formats that this message may not be very well received, and they were willing to do it anyway. But I think that's one thing we probably need to circle back on and see collectively, was our listenership impacted in a up or down or indifferent to the conversation.
Yeah, and I'll add to that you know, with Eddie mentioned his colleagues having the courage. You know, this show, it preempted, and this is not a political statement. This is just fact. It preempted normally where Rush Limbaugh sits at that time,
Right.
and so you have folks who are tuning in to listen to Rush Limbaugh, who all of a sudden are hearing from our program, and so that's you know, that's you know, you're going to get some emails and phone calls from there, right? With such an avid audience that Rush Limbaugh has. I would tell you this: we built at Adcom, we built a website and some social platforms to support Justice for All. And on that day, there were over 3,000 different unique website views, which is pretty significant with a website that just got stood up within 24 hours. And so a lot of people were coming in to number one, re-listen to the program, but also to get some background about the program. So although we don't have the hard metrics in terms of overall listenership, we know there was strong engagement across those platforms.
So you mentioned that this is a challenging topic and that you were able to keep politics out of it. And you might have even had some listeners who were tuning in specifically to hear a political conversation. So as you were prepping for the discussion, how did you work to keep the politics out of a conversation that often heads there?
Eddie, do you mind if I take this first?
No, please.
Yeah, so although it was many years ago, so a couple of things. Although I'm a marketing executive, I also have a content background. And so I'd work with Keith with Tom and Sam and other stations, building out radio networks and programming and working with talent. And it's something that I really do enjoy. So I got a chance to sit with Ramona on a number of occasions. Over the weekend, we spent time reviewing what we wanted the structure of the conversation to look like, and then a number of rounds of questions. But I heard, and I was intentional not to share that with anyone else besides Ramona. We talked about that, and to honor what she had asked Eddie, so that everyone would be a little bit surprised, but we had some guardrails. But anytime you have, in my opinion, anytime you have an elected official, it's going to feel political just by nature. So I'm not sure if it and it's anyone's individual point of view if it's political. But I guess what I would say is throughout the show, we really were only dealing with facts as opposed to policy that might lean in one way or the other, and from a political spectrum standpoint. So I didn't hear anything that I would say was, for the most part, political. It was just people's points of view and policy. So and quite frankly, I thought Ramona did a really nice job asking tough questions of both the mayor and Chief Williams, and I thought that was appropriate. And I, although I thought all the guests did a great job, I really appreciated David Gilbert's point of view as the lone white person, male and corporate leader on the call, and really kind of just saying, hey, here it is, and here's how we have to be able to move forward. And he shared his journey as well, which was uncomfortable. And I thought that was a moment of time that was poignant during the show. And I was hopeful that people would be able to take that away and be able to really connect with his point of view, because it was similar to maybe theirs.
Yeah, I thought it was very important that it not turn into a partisan type conversation, because when we talk about metrics, I mean, there would have been immediate tune out, depending on who was, what side of the spectrum people are politically. So it was very important for us to make sure we stayed on that path. I mean, the mayor we needed to have on because the city of Cleveland was in, the spotlight in terms of, and was sort of the epicenter in Northeast Ohio of what was going on. So it was very appropriate to have him. But if you listen to the mayor, we didn't talk Republican, Democrat. We didn't talk left, right. We didn't talk conservative, liberal. We talked about facts of what was going on. And as long as we stayed there, it stayed a non-political conversation, because had it become political, half of our audiences would have just dropped out just like that. And that's not what we wanted.
In thinking about how you crafted this conversation that stayed out of that realm, how might someone translate that experience to more of a corporate setting where there might be a large array of people who are at different levels of comfort and awareness around issues of race and systemic racism?
I think David Gilbert actually did a brilliant job of addressing that. I think he challenged his executive leadership colleagues in Northeast Ohio to be honest about where you're at when it comes to diversity in your ranks or having these type of conversations, and know that yes, it's an uncomfortable conversation, but we need to have it. So I think he laid out that challenge, I think, in a brilliant way, to give latitude to people to again be uncomfortable and know that it might create emotional discussions that need to be had. To me, I think as a start. And now, the next steps are what's most important, is that if you believe diversity is good for business, then you are willing to have difficult conversations within your own organization. And as a leader, be at the forefront of that, so everybody else under, the leader's umbrella knows that it's important to that particular person. And when we all know that leadership starts at the top, and so if bad results or good results, you're going to, as a leader, going to get the praise when something's great, and you're going to get the blame when something's bad. And so taking the bull by the horns and addressing this, I think, is something I think he laid out again in a great way to allow us to leaders within Northeast Ohio to take the next steps.
Yeah, and Rachel, it's interesting. I appreciate the question. At our agency, a lot of our clients are beginning to ask us this question, or they have asked this question over the last 2 to 3 weeks, really as it relates to where they stand in terms of corporate leadership and understanding their internal and external stakeholders, and where they should stand on issues related to their mission, vision, and values. And I think our counsel has really been that there are moments in time when there's principled leadership and there's kind of business decisions, and this is a moment in time where you have to have principled leadership. And quite frankly, where the clients that we work with and what we're hearing within the marketplace is leaders are starting to feel a lot of pressure from their internal stakeholders, even more so than their external stakeholders. And so their employee base is really pushing to get clarity. They might not like the answer, but they're at least asking, where do we stand? Because I've hitched my wagon as an individual to this corporation, and I want to know where we stand on these issues. So it's a tough conversation, but I think as corporations, their boards and their executive teams get together, hopefully they're listening first and foremost to their employees. They're able to shape number one, their position, and then number two, the why, as they communicate that out to all their internal and external stakeholders appropriately. And I don't want to reference sports too much, but it's just really been incredible over the last, call it 72 hours, what's happened to the NFL team in Washington, and the corporate pressure from venture capitalists, quite frankly, who's forcing that team to make a name change based on a racial slur. So you're hearing more and more of that come through.
So anyone who's tried to put a collaboration together can know that it can be very challenging, especially in a short amount of time. So looking back at how this came together and the relationships and the trust that were in place, what are some best practices or things you've walked away with from this experience that others could learn from to have a successful collaboration?
I think for me is, one thing that Kevin and I, we didn't barricade ourselves with assumptions. We didn't lay out assumptions. We not in our first initial conversation, we made zero assumptions about whether people would be willing to participate or not. And so, as we could have, spent a lot of time deselecting people based on assumptions about how they're going to feel about this. So we really were, let's operate with the assumption that people will say yes as opposed to no. And so the spirit in which we engaged our partners was a reason why we were able to get the quick yes. We said, here's what we are looking to do. And so we sort of set out what the goal was. And they had the opportunity to say no, but they said yes really quickly because we approached them with the assumption that we think you believe this is the right thing to do. And so that's why the yes, to get the yes from everybody was actually the the quickest thing we're able to accomplish. And that allows us to spend more time on the content and all the technical things that needed to happen. So I think sort of point one of that was we did not have assumptions that were counter to the narrative to which we were trying to accomplish. And that was a big deal. And then once the group said yes, we quickly decided what we were all in it for, as opposed to what we were against. And so it was all about forward momentum of what we were trying to accomplish, not what the barriers were. We never talked about the technical issues, so our engineers were probably upset with us because, you know, we cooked up the ideas and then you bring in the engineers and say, we need you to pull this off. But, you know, our engineers said, yes, we can do this, and they got it done because we operated with what we can do versus what we can't do. So that was, to me, was the biggest takeaway was, you know, how we, even with this difficult topic, we operated without, you know, putting up barriers that were from our own lens and biases right up front, because that would have been counterproductive to what we were trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think the art of the possibility was the mindset that we all went into, and I'd probably do this too often, but I'll give you kind of 4 things that I took away. Number one, the relationships you have and your reputation are critical. So everyone here really trusted each other. I know I've said that too often, but that was key to this entire thing. Number 2, we did what we did best. So, you know, whoever had an area of skill within that area that that could help, that's what they did best for us to get this done. So we recognized that quickly, and, you know, Eddie might do one thing and I might do something else, or Sam or Keith, they handle those things in different ways, and we trusted each person to get that done. No one cared about credit, and so we checked the egos at the door. That was really important. You didn't have to know who was involved. We just wanted to do something good, period, point blank. And then finally, I think we all work in somewhat of a creative process. And so we understand that creativity and these things are iterative. And so that gave us some space and latitude that Eddie mentioned earlier to say, okay, we might start here, but throughout this creative process, we might end up in a different spot. But as long as we stayed focused on the outcome that we were looking for, we were confident we're going to get it done. So all those things kind of added up to successful collaboration.
I think that, you know, one thing that Kevin talked about is that we checked the egos at the door. We were very intentional about making sure this didn't look like it was being led by one group or the other. You know, down to the, you know, fact that, you know, we intentionally were thinking of doing this in a studio, and regardless of whose studios we were going to do it at, you know, if you guys see all the interviews, you see mic flags that have the particular studio station name. If it was going to be at my station, we were going to take the mic flags down because this was not a branding opportunity for any of our stations. So little things like that, or when we did the press release, there was a joint statement, not a statement by any one of us. It was a joint statement because we wanted to make sure it didn't look like a Radio 1 event and the others were pulled along, or an iHeart event and the others were pulled along. This was a real collaboration to the highest sense of that word. So things we were very intentional about to make sure that we were all, you know, rowing the same direction, and there was no one group taking credit versus the other. And I think that was something we established pretty quickly that was important to all of us when we agreed to do this, that we were equal partners in this.
So as we begin to look ahead, and as you consider the move to action, what can that look like, and what can this audience do to support that?
Kevin, you want to tackle that one first?
Yeah, sure. You know, we just have, you know, we have a lot of work to do, but I think it starts with something. Again, I'll continue to reference my time with Leadership Cleveland, which was, you know, trying to approach things with an appreciative inquiry mindset. Let's look at what's going well, and where can we build on, and where there are centers of excellence. What is going well? And then once we kind of agree to that and we settle down, then we can find out where there are opportunities for us to improve. And so kind of, you know, in an ideal world, how would we map back to all the things we need to do here in Northeast Ohio, specifically in Cleveland, in order to make this the greatest city in America? And I mean that with all my heart. And if we can do that, and that would mean leveraging all the skills of all of our people, every single person, then I think we have a good place to start. So I'm curious to know, and I know this is really, really difficult, when and how and who or whom will allow us to lay that framework. Because as soon as we do that, then this can be, for me, it's all about where I live and it's about Cleveland. And so that's what I'm focused on right now, is making this the greatest city. So I don't know how to get there, but I know that we can continue to have these conversations. And I try to myself listen to different points of view all the time. And when you do that, then it allows you to understand what you need what you can do for those people that might not think the same way that you do. So it broadens your perspective and it helps you understand the world way bigger than just your own perspective. And I hope we can continue to do that in some way, in a very systematic way, for everyone here in Northeast Ohio.
I think it's critical that we, as leaders all on this call, to, I think David brought this up when he on the forum that day, is to acknowledge that systemic racism and inequities do exist. That's the sort of the starting point, and because if we can't acknowledge that, then progress will be slower than it should be. And so for the leaders on this call, if there was anybody that doesn't believe that, then perhaps you need to spend some time, allow yourself to spend some time with somebody or an organization or somebody that will help you realize that it does exist. Because if you're in a leadership role and you don't acknowledge that exists, then you at some point will be part of the problem and part of the road, bump in the way to progress. And so that's a thing that we have to first start with, that premise that there are systemic issues to deal with, number one. Number two, once you acknowledge that, then you can be part of the solution by challenging some of the things that you see in your own organization. If you're a publicly traded company, what does your board look like? Let's start with that. If your board has zero diversity, then the question would be why? Or your executive leadership ranks is, if your only person of color is your chief diversity officer, that's a problem. And so those are things that, those are just real conversations that I've had with some of my colleagues over the past month, is that those are very real and honest questions that need to be asked. And so and once you address that, then you can say, okay, now that we recognize that's an issue, now what are we going to do about it? Because now the action has to start. And whether that's mentorship programs in your company, or you change the way you look at recruiting, because many in our industry, we'll say, well, there's a problem getting African Americans to do this. Well, maybe we need to approach how we train and recruit. And so those are the things that I think that we've laid out there and will continue to need to lay out. And this is not an overnight an overnight win or success. It's going to take a lot of you on this call to be willing to have the uncomfortable conversations to push things forward, because at the end of the day, we're all in business in some kind of way. And at the end of the day, diversity is great for business. And there's studies and data that suggest that diversity is great for business. And I think we're all interested in doing better in our respective business.
Well, I want to thank you both for sharing your insights today. And to wrap up, I want to share a comment that was shared in the chat box a little earlier from Jill. She listened and watched, and just want to say how meaningful and engaged she found the presentation and the conversation. And thank you both and your teams and partners for making it happen. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Mary Ann.
Thanks, Rachel. And I will echo Jill's sentiments. And it was a great coming together and collaborations on so many levels. And kudos to you for making it happen. And I think you have folks on this call who are willing to take the next step forward with you to realize some change taking place in Cleveland. So thanks for starting everything moving in that direction.